In short, God the Creator, as the God in man, though now fully conscious and completely aware and out of his original divine dream state, yet finds himself not as God, but as man with complete gross consciousness, experiencing the creation of his own original divine dream state as reality. Here it is to be said that the God in man continues to experience in the awake state with the awareness of false reality, the vacant divine dream, as yet another dream of God within that original divine dream. This is the most alluring stage in the state of God when, with full consciousness gained, God is led astray by the false awareness attained to identify himself not with his unlimited and infinite self, but with his most perfect image in the shape of the human being, while God continues to experience the vacant divine dream. Marian, could you continue, please?
All right. All right. Although it appears as the most fantastic imagination, yet it is a fact that the very life of man is the veil that shrouds the reality of the eternal existence of God. It is the irony of divine fate that God gets lost in man to find himself. And the instant that man gets lost in God, God realizes his reality as existence, eternal and infinite. In other words, infinite God becomes infinitely absorbed in his own infinitely perfect image, intently seeking his infinity. And although God does gain full consciousness through it, he does not realize the reality of his own eternal, infinite existence in it. But the instant the full consciousness thus gained ceases to identify God with the infinite reflection of his infinitely perfect image, this image vanishes from the consciousness of God, and God spontaneously and automatically and consciously realizes his own identity as God, the infinite existence, and finds that he alone ever was, always is, and eternally will remain the only reality. Thus, God in the man state, at first realizing himself as man, asserted his limited aspects through the limited self or the limited ego, the limited mind, the limited energy, and the finite gross body. Then eventually and ultimately realizing himself as God, he manifests his unlimited, unbounded, infinite trio nature of infinite knowledge, infinite power, and infinite bliss through his divine, unlimited self. While depicting through the 7 different primary stages, the process of unfoldment of the latent consciousness of God in his original unconscious divine sound sleep state, as compared with the 7 different primary states of man gaining consciousness right from his unconscious sound sleep state to the state wherein he gains full consciousness and wakes up completely with wide open eyes, it is found that this is the process of the evolution of consciousness of God, which eventually identifies the fully conscious God with the fully conscious man, after identifying God with all and everything inanimate and animate in the drama of the divine dream of creation. Right from the unconscious state, compared to the divine sound sleep state, until full and complete consciousness is gained in the man state, compared to the wide open eyes of man experiencing the gross world, God remains one, indivisible, infinite, formless, and eternally all-pervading. But it is the all-pervading, infinite nature of God that expresses consciously and unconsciously his eternal divine existence, directly and indirectly, in one and all states and forms, through their expressions of their very being. The whole process of evolution was an absolutely spontaneous outcome of the original infinite whim, surging in the unconscious God to become conscious of his eternal and infinite existence. And, paradoxical as it may seem, in the process of evolution, the unconsciousness of God urged the gradual unfoldment of the latent consciousness of God, which consciousness grew greater and greater through a gradual, systematic, and progressive process of gathering and experiencing varied and innumerable impressions through identifying God with varied and innumerable gross forms. So it is that the evolving consciousness of God gives rise to the identification of God with forms and states of forms of higher and higher types. This identification of God, in turn, gives rise to an apparently unending chain of associations and dissociations, or the so-called births and deaths of forms and beings which continue to form and assert and then dwindle away in the nothingness, leaving behind the legacy of impressions, which in turn again lead the evolving consciousness of God to identify himself with yet another form molded of the very impressions left behind by the form that dwindled away. Through the process of evolution, the unconscious God did eventually gain full consciousness when the evolved consciousness of God eventually identified God with the human form. But this full consciousness gained was impressioned consciousness, and therefore did not make God realize the original infinite state of God. On the contrary, God realized that he is man, Thus God, after having the original whim of his first word, "Who am I?" at this stage finds himself to be man and experiences the gross world, apparently living in it as man and quite oblivious of his infinite and eternal existence until he finds the real answer to his first word of, "Who am I?" to be, "I am God."
Thanks, Marian. Elizabeth, would you read for us now?
Yes. Wait, sorry. We're at, so it is, yeah. So it is that the original whim created the nothing, and the impressions or the sanskaras preserve that nothing as the nothingness, i.e., the creation and creatures of creation. And eventually, the opposite impressions will ultimately uproot these impressions and destroy that nothingness to give realization of reality.
Slow down just a tad, please.
Okay. It was the original whim of God that affected in the absolutely independent God, the infinite triune attributes of God the Creator, God the Preserver, God the Destroyer, i.e., Brahma, Vishnu, Mahesh. It is God's original whim itself that is responsible for bestowing upon God infinite attributes such as the Creator, the Preserver, the Destroyer. These infinite triune attributes of God consistently force assertion through consistent formation, conservation, and dissolution of all things and beings in existence. Even in the everyday life of man and of all creatures in creation, this infinite triune aspect of God consistently appears to assert through consistent births, procreations, maintaining the preservation, and deaths. The original first word to the original whim of God, created out of the latent nothing, the latent original first impression of who am I? And this original first impression procreated the latent nothingness as the original creation. In turn, the procreation of the nothingness procreates the impressions which continue to preserve the nothingness consistently as the original creation, until eventually this nothingness is destroyed by opposite impressions through the process of reincarnation and involution of consciousness. And the final answer of I am God is obtained to the first word, who am I? It is in accordance with the procreated impressions of the varied individualized conscious assertions of inanimate and animate forms and beings that illusion consistently maintains its apparently infinite and varied stand. It is because of this unfailing and apparently unending chain of varied, individualized, procreated impressions that the original creation, originating out of the original whim of God, is consistently preserved while being concurrently evolved so that every individualized form and being in existence may consciously experience the answers to the first word, who am I? As I am an inanimate thing, I am an animate creature, I am a rational being, I am a man, and I am a woman. For example, when God in the man state as man is in sound sleep, and when time and space as the day and the universe of the man have all been apparently destroyed for him, then what is it that every day unfailingly creates his daily morning for him? And again, when man wakes up every day, then what is it that unfailingly creates for him his universe and all the things that are of it and in it? It is the man's own dormant impressions gathered during the course of the evolution of consciousness and during the process of reincarnation that incite his own dormant consciousness during sound sleep to wake him up inadvertently every day, so that the man's own dormant impressions may have the necessary scope to become exhausted through conscious experiences during his awake state. In this manner, the man's own impressions in the dormant state create for the man his own morning and his own universe every day. Although both the daily morning and the universe of the man were simultaneously created for him by his own dormant impressions, yet both were already handily preserved for him by his own impressions of his life in the everyday awake state, and also through the procreation in his own sorry, I lost my place, of his own everyday life, of deeper and deeper impressions or sanskaras of the already existing illusion, or of the original creation, which sprang from the original whim of God. Eventually, both the morning or the day and the universe of that man are destroyed by the man's own opposite impressions experienced in his sleep state, which are diametrically opposite to the impressions of his awake state.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Mahu, would you please read for us?
Okay, sure. Hence, in regular unfailing succession, God in the man state as man consistently asserts himself as the creator of his own creation through the dormant impressions of man, as the preserver of his own creation through man's leading the everyday life in the awake state, procreating the impressions of creation, and as the destroyer of his own creation through the opposite impressions of man when he falls asleep and ultimately passes away in the sound sleep state. Every day, finally, destroying the very creation as individualized by his consciousness, man once again creates, preserves, and destroys the whole creation through the play of impressions. Even through the very being of everything and of every creature, God consistently asserts his infinite triune attributes as the creator, the preserver, and the destroyer. As in the nature of the man state, so also in the nature of every state of God, God consistently asserts directly and indirectly, apparently and really, his infinite triune attributes of creator, preserver, and destroyer at one and the same time. Even in the very pulsation of the heart and in the functioning of the lungs, the three aspects of the infinite triune attributes never fails to assert. With every pulsation of the heart expands, relaxes in the refractory period, and contracts, simultaneously heralding the advent of the birth of a being on the one hand, and sustaining the life of the being on the other hand. And finally, with the eventual and final contraction leading to the physical death of the being. Thus, it is that the triune attributes of God, as God the Creator, God the Preserver, and God the Destroyer, Brahma, Vishnu, and Mahesh or Shiva, assert independently as well as simultaneously in all things and in every creature and in all beings, in every state of God, at every stage in the evolution of consciousness, and on every plane in the involution of consciousness, until eventually the original cosmic creation, having sustained the ages, cycles, and periods, and being preserved by the play of cosmic impressions, is finally destroyed by the play of cosmic opposite impressions of God. This final destruction is generally known as Mahaparalaya, meaning the greatest of the great event of absorption, when the whole cosmic creation as nothingness is absorbed infinitely by the everything. In the process of evolution, unconscious God did obtain full consciousness, not of his original infinite state, but of the gross and finite. After all the struggle during the course of evolution, which achieved full consciousness for God, no doubt, at what price was it gained? The cost was the burden of the legacy of impressions accumulated in the gross form, the last medium of association of the evolving consciousness of God, through which full consciousness was completely evolved in the instant that God identified himself with the human form. Therefore, God in the man state is still unaware of his original state, despite having gained full consciousness. This unawareness is due to the unwanted, though necessary, burden of the gross impressions still clinging to the full consciousness gained. The process through which God in the man state struggles to unburden these finite impressions is one which takes place through opposite impressions and is called the process of reincarnation. In trying to unburden consciousness from the finite impressions, the gross consciousness of God necessarily has to experience these impressions and then exhaust them by innumerable opposite experiences through a series of reincarnations. Experiences opposite by nature are absolutely essential to exhaust the impressions, because opposite experiences alone can shake up the roots of thickly set or firmly established varied impressions.
Thank you, Mahu. Ernie, would you please continue?
In the process of reincarnation, the fully gross conscious God in man, fortified with fully developed subtle and mental bodies, which are consistently, though unconsciously used, must necessarily experience a series of unending chains of varied and innumerable experiences, opposite by nature, in order that the impressions of opposites might be exhausted. These impressions are constantly being imprinted upon or picked up by the mental body or the mind of man, and are retained or released by the subconsciousness in man. When these impressions are released through the subconsciousness and full consciousness of God in man, as man, he has varied experiences according to the variety and the intensity of the impressions released. Whereas the subtle body of man, which is the seat of energy, energizes these impressions to activate man into committing actions in his everyday life of either the dream or awake state, as the case may be. These actions are also opposite in nature to the varied related opposite impressions. Thus, in the man state, on the gross plane, although energy and the mind are fully developed and are continually and consistently used, yet they are employed indirectly and unconsciously. When on the planes of energy, in other words, on the subtle planes, this energy is divinely and consciously made use of. But on the subtle planes, the mind is made use of indirectly and unconsciously. On the mental planes, when this mind is made use of divinely and consciously, energy is only made use of indirectly and unconsciously. See also Meher Baba, Control of Mind over Energy and Matter, Life at its Best. It necessarily follows that while this gross conscious God in the man state experiences the opposites in the gross world, he reincarnates a number of times, sometimes as a male, sometimes as a female, in the varied caste, creeds, nationalities, and colors, and in very different places and continents, always reviewing opposite impressions and exhausting them by experiences of opposites. It is always through these diverse oppositional impressions and their respective opposed experiences that gross conscious God in the man state on earth can easily one day, after millions of rebirths, thin out the thick set impressions. It is the process of this cycle of so-called deaths and births of human forms that ultimately urges the consciousness of the gross conscious God in the man state to involve. This process of involution of consciousness gradually takes shape when the gross impressions gradually grow fainter and scarcer. Involution of the consciousness of God in the man state is only possible when the opposite impressions, after a very, very long process, gradually thin out through the process of unfailing reincarnations, which leads to the limit of gross impressions. When the limit of gross impressions is reached, then the stage is attained where a gross conscious God in the man state gradually becomes dissociated from the gross world as the involution of consciousness begins to enfold the consciousness. Simultaneously with the beginning of the involution of consciousness, God in the man state gradually dissociates from experiencing the impressions of the opposites of the gross world. It was seen that God attained full consciousness through the process of evolution of consciousness. But the full consciousness gained was a consciousness that was impressioned. In order to wipe the impressions off of the full consciousness gained, the process of reincarnation and the process of involution of consciousness must be followed through. The process of the evolution of consciousness of God was compared to the gradual opening of the eyes of man. When man opened his eyes completely, it was compared with the end of the evolution of consciousness, because God then had gained full consciousness. The process of the reincarnation of God in the man state may be compared with the man completely awake, with full consciousness and with eyes wide open, gaining diverse experiences opposite to the impressions he gathered during the years of his life, and which he now actively experiences during the course of his days, forgetting his own self amid the execution of his multifarious activities.
Thank you, Ernie. Ralph, would you like to read, Ralph?
Unmute. Yeah, I'd love to. My glasses are kind of fogged up, but I can see it. The process of reincarnation of God. Did we read that?
Yeah, we just read that, starting
Now,
where I highlight.
now the urge. I see it. Okay. Now the urge for the involution of the consciousness of God in the man state may be compared with the man who, having can you go down one line, Eugene? There's a word I can't see because of the speaker view is blocking it, unless there's not a word after having. That, where'd it go? God. Now the urge for the involution of consciousness of God in the man state may be compared with the man who, having been engrossed in his activities of the day, at last finds time when the day's work is practically over to pay attention to his own self rather than to his activities. Thus urged, man's attention shifts automatically from external activities towards paying proper attention to his own self. Just as full consciousness was evolved in 7 different stages, so too evolved full consciousness is completely involved through the process of involution in 7 different stages. These 7 stages of involution of consciousness are named the 7 planes of consciousness. The 7th plane is the 7th and last stage in the process of involution of consciousness, where consciousness is completely involved and God consciously realizes his eternal infinite existence. That is, God, who was originally unconscious, now becomes oblivious of oblivion itself. These 7 stages of gradual involution of the consciousness of God in the man state may be compared with the wide open eyes of a man at first gazing straight ahead of him and away from himself. Then, in an attempt to behold his own self, he lowers his eyes gradually, shifting them in 7 stages until eventually his range of vision includes his own self. Through unfailing, numerous reincarnations, wherein a, what's that word? L-I-M. You're muted, Eugene.
The word is limit, Ralph.
Wherein a limit to gross experiences is reached. And when the gross impressions become faint and almost defunct, the gross consciousness of gross conscious God in the man state gradually begins to involve. And there's a chart. God in the state of man is initiated into the process of involution of consciousness. How's that?
Very, very good.
Thank you, Jay Baba.
Jay Baba. Marion, back to you.
At this stage, the involving gross consciousness experiences partially the first stage or plane of the subtle world through the medium of the already fully developed subtle body of God in the man state. This is the initial stage before the first plane, where the involved gross consciousness of gross conscious God in the man state obtains the first glimpses of the first plane of the subtle world and experiences their impressions partially through the gross body and partially through the subtle body. Here, both the gross and the subtle senses are simultaneously used. This is the stage where God in the man state stands, as it were, on the line of demarcation, which delimits the gross world from the subtle world, and where the consciousness of God in the man state experiences strange things. With his gross eyes, he obtains glimpses of the subtle plane. With his gross ears, he hears celestial music of the subtle plane. With his gross nose, he enjoys subtle sense. In short, gross conscious God in the man state, partially on the first plane of the subtle world, experiences subtle impressions with the gross senses. With further involution of gross consciousness, gross conscious God gradually experiences completely the first plane of the subtle world. Now, the gross consciousness of God in the man state is no longer gross consciousness, but is subtle consciousness. Subtle conscious God in the man state gradually becomes conscious of the second plane of the subtle world as the involution progresses on and on to enfold consciousness further and further. This subtle world is the domain of infinite energy, the infinite and unlimited power, which is an aspect of the infinite trio nature of God. When radiated from unbounded infinity into the finite worlds of illusion, is translated into the finite and manifested in the domain of the subtle world in the form of infinite energy of the subtle world. Thus, in the second plane, God in human form is subtle conscious, and therefore he is not conscious of the gross body and the mental body, the mind. But God in human form does work through the gross body and through the mind, the mental body, not directly, but on and from the subtle plane. Therefore, even if subtle conscious God in the man state is unconscious of the gross body and of the mental body, and does not experience directly the gross and mental worlds, still, God in the man state does make use of the gross body, though not directly, but from the subtle plane, through various aspects of the gross, and is therefore observed from all outward appearances as an ordinary gross conscious human form, which eats, drinks, sleeps, sees, feels, hears, and so forth. Similarly, God in the man state, when conscious of the second plane of the subtle world, does use his mental body, that is, the mind, not directly, but through various aspects which give it the outward appearance of being an ordinary, gross conscious human form, having thoughts, desires, and emotions. At this stage, with greater involution of consciousness, subtle conscious God in the man state on the second plane gains greater awareness of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere and is now capable of performing tricks or minor miracles of a lower degree through the release of this infinite energy, and can demonstrate such powers as converting a dry tree into a green one, and vice versa, stopping railway trains and motor cars, filling a dry well with water, and so forth. This subtle conscious God in the man state on the second plane experiences the subtle world with these subtle senses of his subtle body. He is now totally not conscious of the gross world. Though from all outward appearances, he remains and functions as an ordinary man, eating, sleeping, having feelings of pain and pleasure, and so forth. Yet actually, his involved consciousness experiences not the gross, but the subtle sphere, and creates fresh, subtle impressions through his subtle senses, which are 3 in number, with faculties only of seeing, smelling, and hearing. Further involution of consciousness makes it possible for God in the man state to experience the third plane of the subtle world. Here, subtle consciousness gains greater awareness of the infinite energy of the subtle sphere. And God, in the man state, experiences greater finite power. In this stage, he is capable of performing grand miracles such as giving sight to the blind, restoring limbs to the maimed, and sometimes even raising the dead into life. In this state, subtle conscious God in the man state is also capable of experiencing the different planes and worlds of the subtle sphere, just as a gross conscious human form is capable of traveling from one continent to another using the gross vehicles at his disposal.
Thanks, Marion. Ernie, could you please continue?
The second and third planes of the subtle world are the two major planes which are solely in the domain of the subtle world. The first plane is partially in the domain of the subtle world and partially of the gross world. Similarly, the fourth plane is partially of the subtle world and partially of the mental world. For this reason, the fourth plane is said to be the threshold of the mental world. Now, with gradual, though progressive gain in the involution of the consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state, the consciousness of God experiences the fourth plane of the subtle come mental. In the fourth plane, God in the man state is fully conscious of the subtle body and completely experiences the subtle sphere. And therefore, he is completely aware of the subtle nature of the subtle sphere, which is infinite energy. This is the very same infinite energy, which is the finite aspect in the nothingness of that infinite and unbounded power of God, which was latent in God's state of the everything. In the fourth plane, God in the man state is fully equipped with infinite energy, and thus he is now capable of raising the dead and of even creating new forms in new worlds, breathing with life. Subtle conscious God in the man state, in the fourth plane, is in reality infinite energy personified. This infinite energy of the fourth plane of the subtle come mental worlds is not the ordinary so-called energy of the gross world. It is that infinite energy which is called the breath of all life, or pran, and which can cause all things to become alive. It is this energy which, when infinite, can create living things out of dust. Although this energy be infinite, it is yet by no means equivalent to the reality of that infinite power of God. This infinite power of God, when translated into illusion, becomes a finite aspect of the infinite energy of the fourth plane of the subtle come mental worlds. Subtle conscious God in the man state, possessing the key to the store of the infinite energy of the fourth plane, is now firmly established on the threshold of the mental world and is confronted by the full blast of the intense desires, emotions, and thoughts, which are the aspects of mind of the mental world. Though the fourth plane is the exalted stage of consciousness, where God in the man state consciously experiences himself as infinite energy personified. Yet it is the state of experiences of the so-called darkest night, because here the consciousness of God in the man state undergoes the experience of being caught, as it were, between the devil and the deep. Fired by intense desires and emotions, the overpowering incitement or temptation to wield and use the infinite energy, which is at his command, proves a treacherous foe at this juncture, when the involution of consciousness of subtle conscious God in the man state is unfailingly and rapidly progressing towards the mental sphere, where it will gain mastery over all desires, emotions, and thoughts. If desires at their zenith emanated by the mental plane, confronting the consciousness of God in the man state in the fourth plane, overpower God in the man state on the fourth plane, and if the forces generated by the infinite energy at his command are released by him, then the experience of the liberation of infinite energy at this juncture often proves fatal, especially when he grossly misuses the forces liberated by infinite energy to satisfy selfish ends indiscriminately. At this juncture on the fourth plane, if the power of the infinite energy of the subtle world is indiscriminately liberated, the resultant effect of the complete liberation of that energy is almost unimaginable by gross consciousness. However, an idea could be gathered of that result from the fantastic experiences of the liberation of nuclear energy, which is merely one of the gross aspects of the infinite energy of the subtle world.
Thank you, Ernie. Rolf, would you care to read again? I guess he's not.
No, here I am. Have we
Nice.
lost Mahu? Isn't she next?
Yeah, she had a previous appointment.
I
Yeah.
see. Thus, if the involved consciousness of God in the man state succumbs to the temptations of experiencing the complete liberation of infinite energy in the fourth plane of consciousness, the inevitable experience is so severe that the full consciousness gained and the subtle consciousness experienced totally disintegrate into the most finite consciousness, identifying God once again with the most finite, gross form of stone. Consequently, the consciousness of stone conscious God must once again go through the whole process of the evolution of consciousness, identifying himself with gross forms until he identifies with man and again wins full consciousness. It is a fact that when consciousness is once gained, it can never be lost. But the disintegration of consciousness from the fourth plane is the one exception of this rule. This disintegration of consciousness occurs only in the case of fourth plane consciousness. And that too only very, very rarely when he succumbs to the temptation of misusing the powers of that plane. If God in the man state in the fourth plane does not misuse the powers of infinite energy, but uses them discriminately without being overpowered by desires, then with further involution of consciousness, the subtle conscious God in the man state experiences directly the sixth plane of the mental world, skipping over the experiences of the fifth plane of the mental world. But if God in the man state in the fourth plane neither uses nor abuses the powers of infinite energy, then gradually, with further involution of consciousness, subtle conscious God in the man state in the fourth plane of consciousness crosses the threshold of the mental world and begins to experience the fifth plane of consciousness. The fifth and sixth planes of consciousness are fundamentally the planes of the mental sphere of the mind in the mental world. Now, should we briefly discuss those two paragraphs differentiating the conditions contingent with whether the God in the man state goes directly to the sixth plane or gradually crosses over into the fifth plane? I read it, but I didn't quite get the nuts and bolts, the comprehension.
Oh, Rolf, that's okay. This is just a reading only, reading recording. Yeah.
I see. Okay, right.
But what you could do is read this.
Well, I hope I didn't goof up the recording here.
Oh, well.
Edit it.
Oh, well.
Okay.
Read this asterisk for us, though.
Desires must be consciously wiped out because they can create new impressions, and in turn, further desires, which may lead to further binding actions. Consciousness is preoccupied with such impressions, and then physical expression rather than with the real self. If these impressions are wiped away consciously, the soul will then begin to perceive the truth and will begin to emancipate itself from the tyranny of worldly desires. The individual, Jivatman, minus life of desires becomes soul, Atma, and is always the unconscious Almighty. It is while we are living that life must be given up. To renounce worldly desires while retaining consciousness of unconsciousness is the goal of life.
Thank you, Ralph. So here we've gotten to the bottom of page 119, and we'll continue next week.
Thank you. Jai Baba. Yeah.
Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.